So my name is Michelle Grossman. I am the co-convener of the AVERT Research Network, and we are absolutely thrilled both to welcome you to the AVERT webinar today, and in particular, to welcome Emma Belton. Emma is going to be presenting to us on understanding the progression to violence, background characteristics, and risk factors for radicalization to violent extremism. Emma is a PhD candidate and senior research assistant in the School of Social Science at the University of Queensland, where her doctoral research, and she is minutes away from submitting her PhD, where her doctoral research focuses on individual radicalisation and violent extremism here in Australia. And her work is really seeking, in particular, to help us understand the distinctions between violent and non-violent behavioural outcomes. She's worked on a range of projects in the CVE area and has also developed integrity guidelines for CVE initiatives, as well as evaluating both custody and community-based CVE programs in Australia. So just before Emma begins the presentation, a couple of house rules and one announcement. So the house rules are simply to say Emma will be speaking for about 30 minutes, and we will then have plenty of time for Q&A with everybody who's online. We'll take your questions at the end. Please put them in the Q&A section. There's a little Q&A tab at the bottom of your screens. So just click on that, type in your question, and we will come to those after Emma has finished her own presentation. The announcement is just a quick reminder that, of course, the AVERT International Research Symposium for 2023 is coming up at the end of September, from 26 to 28 September. This year's theme is on democracy, dissent, and violent extremism, with some wonderful international keynote speakers, and already a really exciting list of proposals coming in. Just a reminder that our proposals close on the 21st of July, and we hope to see many of you either presenting or attending, or of course both. So with that, Emma, over to you.
Thank you, Michelle, for that very lovely introduction. I'll just start sharing my screens. If I could get a nod or a yes to say they can see something that looks like slides.
All good, all good.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining me. I'm both flattered and horrified by the amount of people that are here. So thank you for that. So I'm going to talk to you today about my thesis findings, which, as Michelle said, I am very close to submitting. My supervisors were Adrian Cherney and Renee Zanhau, who have been very patient with me these last few months leading up to submission. And my research was actually funded by Adrian's ARC Future Fellowship at the time. So in the interest of time and understanding that it is 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I will get going. So I'm just going to very quickly situate where my research fits into the broader literature very quickly, just to give you a bit of an idea, and then I'm going to move on to what my main research focus was, look at the bit of the methodology and go through the results, and hopefully get to some questions at the end. So who we consider terrorists include a wide range of actors and individuals from various backgrounds. So this called for a more nuanced approach in identifying traits and characteristics of certain offender types. So there's been a lot of research that's done this in different ways. So researchers have looked at the diversity in terrorist roles. They've looked at lone actors compared to group actors. But what my main interest was conducting research that builds on studies that speaks to the importance of desegregating terrorist behaviour. So individuals that have actually radicalised to extremism and participated in some sort of behaviour. And as we know, radicalisation does have many outcomes and different types of involvement. So my research specifically aimed at increasing our understanding of what factors are actually associated with radicalisation to extremism. And then from here, what factors actually can distinguish between those that go on to participate in violent behaviour compared to those that participate in non-violent behaviour. So this was sort of my main area that I was focusing on. So to do this, I focused on a lot of different categories of risk factors, obviously drawing on the literature more broadly, looking at individual, social and environmental factors, and broke these down into sort of 3 key aims and research questions. So the first one was to look at commonalities amongst extremists. So what factors were associated? What did their backgrounds look like? And it was, the main aim here was to provide a sort of systematic overview of these backgrounds and factors associated with individuals who have radicalized to extremism, who adhere to different ideologies and participate in different types of behaviors. So then from there, the second main focus was to then, in what selection of these factors can actually explain differences between types of involvement. So which factors are relevant to identifying differences between violent and non-violent extremists. And then finally, my last main aim was to test and look at different explanatory components derived from radicalisation frameworks and criminology theories to explain how people do radicalise to violent extremism. So looking at how well these perspectives could explain this process more generally. And I will talk hopefully very briefly about that model that I did create for the purpose of my thesis. So let's jump right into sort of methodology. To answer those research questions, I drew on data from the Profiles of Individual Radicalisation in Australia, or PIRA, which I will refer to it from here on in because it's a mouthful. Some of you may have heard of this data set. So it's based and partially replicated off an existing database in the US, PIRUS. So this is, PIRUS is one of the largest is the largest open source data set and collected data on profiles of violent and non-violent extremists who adhere to different ideologies. And this was developed by the University of Maryland. So PIRA is a replication of this database, obviously in the Australian context. So PIRA captures individuals who have radicalized to extremism throughout quite a broad time frame, so from 1985 to 2002. The reason these dates were selected was information, or the reliability of information on perpetrators of extremism. It wasn't really clear or available until about 1985, so we decided this was the cutoff date. And it also captures individuals across the ideological spectrum. So it focuses on both Islamists and jihadists and looks at individuals who adhere to the far right, far left, and also includes those that have single issue ideologies or grievance fueled ideologies. And one of the major benefits of PIRA was that it includes a diverse sample of ideologically motivated behavior. So it isn't limited to those that have been convicted or charged with a terrorist offence. So it's much broader than that. And it does capture those that are violent and non-violent. And violent in PIRA is defined as someone who was actively planning the commission of terrorist violence. Non-violent individuals are those who typically facilitate or support violent terrorist actions by more indirect means. So this could be providing monetary support or sourcing weapons. And this is just a very quick snapshot of what the PIRA data set looks like currently. So there's 254 individuals. Around half of those were officially charged with a terrorist offence. And you can see the split there between violent and non-violent involvement. It was a paper just released that was written by myself and my supervisors, which has much more information about this and the data collection, but I will speak briefly to data collection in relation to my research. So data collection began around late 2018 and finished up sort of mid to late last year. And data was collected by myself and several research assistants, and we drew on open source data ranging from court transcripts to government reports and online news articles. These sources were triangulated. Obviously, one of the limitations of drawing on open source data, which I'm sure everyone is acutely aware of, is the reliability. So we endeavoured to prioritise more reliable sources, and about half the cases were generated drawing on court data. So in Australia here, we are lucky in the sense that we have sort of increased access to those sentencing transcripts, perhaps compared to other countries. There are more details about how we went about this in the paper if you are interested. A code book was also developed to create consistency amongst myself and the other research assistants. So this was written by myself and follows a very similar procedure to the PIRIS codebook, obviously, because it is a partial replication. And it does capture 122 variables, both qualitative and quantitative, which is one of the major benefits of PIRA, in that it captures two different types of data, which allows obviously for different types of data analysis. And it captures information across a broad range of variables. So it looks at backgrounds, looks at group affiliation, radicalisation, catalysts or factors, looks at ideology and different plot details if that's relevant to the offender. So my research drew on quantitative data, and there was also some amendments made to the codebook, and this was mostly to account for differences in context. So looking at things like legislative terms in Australia compared to the US can be quite different. So there were amendments made, and that is laid out in the codebook, and that's sort of a snapshot of it that you see there. We also added a few variables. So this was things like if the individual identified as a lone actor, if they were under any legislative restrictions, as I'm sure, again, a lot of you are aware of, there has been an increase in the use of those. And we included variables such as history of violence or violence against women, which sort of added to the amount and the number of amount of information we were able to gather. To further ensure consistency, I did run some inter-rater reliability tests. So 20% of the cases were coded by myself and research assistants and were distributed at random. And I then ran some analyses, and alpha came back that indicates a high inter-rater reliability between the coders, which was good and somewhat surprising. Another obvious limitation of open source data is there is typically high levels of missing data. We did employ several techniques to try to minimize the amount of missing data. Again, you can refer to the paper which talks about this in more detail. But for example, one technique we employed was if there was strong logical arguments that could be made for treating variables as no rather than missing, we did do that, especially for more sort of crucial variables. And the other techniques we employed, you can sort of look at in that paper if you would like. So using this data, I conducted 3 interrelated studies. Now, these studies do correspond with the research questions that I outlined at the start there. So the first study took an exploratory approach, and it was guided very much by the evidence base to essentially try to identify traits and risk factors across individual, social, and environmental domains that were associated with the individuals within PIRA. So it employs the whole data set, so 254 individuals. I didn't conduct any data imputation for this study. And the reason for that is I wanted to provide a clear and transparent representation of the PIRA database without any sort of data manipulation. So from here, I then drew on a selection of factors explored in study 1 and analysed their capacity to differentiate between violent and non-violent extremists in study 2. Now, study 2 does draw on a smaller analytic sample, and this was to create more consistency with the dependent variables. So obviously I was looking at violent and non-violent populations. Essentially 100 individuals were removed that were either foreign fighters or those that went overseas to support or participate with terrorist organisations. And this was because I wanted to really focus on those who primarily engaged in behaviours within Australia. And this also then allowed the dependent variable to be much more equally weighted. So to do this, I ran some bivariate analyses and ran logistic regression models looking at these different clustering of risk factors to determine their relevance in differentiating between these two populations. The final study then draws on the risk factors that were deemed important from the first 2 studies, and I use those to operationalize and test the integrated model that I proposed to explain radicalisation that leads to violence. It does draw on the same sample, and I should say that both study 2 and study 3, I ran multiple imputation to deal with missing data in order to run the analyses. So I'm not going to get into too much nitty-gritty with statistics and everything I found. Obviously, I'm just going to try and highlight or give everyone a bit of an overall picture of what I found and the most important findings. And I'm going to stop and have a drink if that's all right. So study 1 looked at background characteristics and risk factors associated with the PIRA sample. You can see down at the bottom left there that the distribution of ideological alignment is quite heavily weighted towards Islamists, which was not particularly surprising. So generally, when I was looking at backgrounds of these extremists, I found typically they were mostly male. Again, not so surprising. There was a trend towards younger age groups. So over half the sample was under the age of 25, and there was quite a bit of clustering between that pre-teenage years and young adulthood. So a lot of the samples sort of fell within those age groups. Educational attainment was relatively low, so not a lot of individuals finished or attained their high school education or got a high school diploma. And there was also some evidence to suggest that there was heightened criminogenic backgrounds. So criminal histories were quite common. Mental illness was particularly high across the sample. And there was also some evidence that individuals had some more problematic upbringings, issues at home, that kind of thing. So moving now towards more factors associated or aligned with terrorist involvement or radicalisation involvement, grievances were incredibly high across the sample, which again is not particularly surprising. So most of the sample held some sort of grievance or had some sort of perceived injustice. The other main finding was that extremists had deeply embedded social networks, and this was across different domains or different aspects. So there was a high proportion of individuals that had a close friend or their peer groups were quite extreme, or they had a very good friend that was considered extreme. Social media use was quite prevalent too. In my study, I captured both active and passive use. So active use looks at individuals actually communicating with each other. Passive use is more of that sort of engagement of extremist material, but not actively communicating with others. So this generally just represents that overall over 70% of the sample used the internet somehow to engage with extremist materials or messaging. And most of the sample also was associated with or a member of an extremist group. The interesting thing about this study was, and this leads on to study 2, is that all of these factors, except for age, were not able to differentiate between those that went on to engage in violent behavior compared to those who didn't. So that leads on really nicely to my second study. So drawing on the analytic sample, I looked at 26 factors, and I'm not going to go through, as I said, all of the results, but 11 of these were significantly associated with the increased odds of violent behavior. So the most important findings I found from this study was emotional and cognitive states typically were most important in predicting violent behavior. So a commitment to ideological beliefs significantly increased the likelihood of violence. Now, commitment to ideological beliefs in this study has nothing to do with ideology. It has nothing to do with the individual's comprehension of the ideology. It only is looking at the individual's devotion to that ideology and the narratives and ideas within that ideology. So how committed were they to these ideas rather than someone who was maybe not so much bound to them? Social isolation was probably one of the biggest risk factors across all my studies that predicted violent involvement. So social isolation in PIRA is looking at those that were excluded or isolated from friends, family, social institutions, society in general. Anger was also linked with violent individuals. So anger in PIRA looks at individuals who were angry at Australian society. So maybe they didn't accept the moral validity of the value system, or they opposed specific policies. So this is what anger was sort of looking at here. The next thing I found was when I looked at networks, as I said, peer groups typically didn't increase the likelihood of violence, but having a spouse or a family member that was considered extreme or to hold extremist views significantly increased the likelihood of violent involvement. Looking now at more structural factors, so triggers, when I looked at these, one that stood out the most was individuals who had some sort of strain or trigger that was related to Australian government actions or leaders or related agencies increase the likelihood of violent involvement. So this is if individuals felt particularly targeted by Australian government agencies or their laws or policies. And finally, looking at group variables, membership to an informal group was associated with violence. So an informal group is essentially a group of extremists with still that hierarchical structure. There's still roles, there's still leaders, but they're not designated terrorist organizations, sometimes referred to as cells in the literature. And also being a part of a clique, which is a group of close-knit insular friends of extremists. The last thing I will say about this study is that membership to a formal terrorist organization was actually associated with increased odds of non-violent involvement, which was quite interesting, which maybe suggests the need to further explore into different types of group structures and their impact on facilitating or mobilizing violence. So finally, study 3, as I said, looked at testing my integrated model. We know a lot of the radicalisation frameworks haven't gone through a lot of empirical testing. So my goal here was to integrate criminological and radicalisation frameworks to see how well they could explain this process. I am not going to try to explain this in depth. I'm going to be as brief as possible. But essentially, the integrated model of violence, which is what I called it, because it seemed to make the most sense, has 6 components. One of those is the outcome, which is violent radicalisation. And the other I'll go through very briefly now. So the first component you'll see there is vulnerability. Sorry, I should say that these components are not chronological. They don't appear in any order. They are interactive in nature. That's the way they were sort of designed. So vulnerability measures demographic variables. It looks at emotional and cognitive states. It accounts essentially for the individual's lived experience and measures levels of susceptibility, kind of similar in the way that we measure criminogenic susceptibility. And I use 3 risk factors to operationalize this. Enabling environments looks at exposure, so individuals' interaction with their social environment that may reinforce certain extremist ideas or narratives or types of behaviours. So this draws on levels of social learning and can occur through family, peers, and engagement with online or offline social settings. I use 2 risk factors to operationalize this. Networks looks at group membership, so membership or increased engagement or association with extremist groups, which can then mobilize or initiate the motivation to act through group dynamics such as peer pressure or social identity fusion. And I use 2 factors to operationalize networks. The strain component looks at contextual strains such as dissatisfaction with government actions, and that essentially generates the foundation for negative emotions. And that was also operationalized using 2 factors. And the last one, intensity of beliefs, looks at, again, similar to study 2. It doesn't talk about the type of ideology or the comprehension. It merely is looking at an individual's level of commitment to that ideology and the beliefs and ideas within that ideology. So the interaction and combined influence of all of these were hypothesized to heighten the risk of radicalization and trigger pathways towards violent involvement compared to non-violent involvement. And when testing all of these, I found that 4 factors within 4 of the major model domains were responsible for this process. Factors within strain didn't seem to have any significance within this. So the factors that were significant, as I said, each coming from one of the major components, so social isolation, having a radical family member or spouse, being a member of an informal terrorist group, and increased commitment to ideological beliefs were associated, with increased likelihood of violence. Now, based on the data, I am not obviously able to establish causality or temporality in what order they occur in. But the data does suggest that this particular combination of factors are central to driving escalation to violence in a sample of extremists. So altogether, I will talk very briefly about some issues and limitations to do with the study, and then talk about the policy and practice implications of this, and then get to questions. So obvious limitation is the use of open source data, which we know. Obviously, we do sometimes have to rely on secondary sources, especially if we want to be doing sort of statistical analysis with large numbers. So we did attempt to address the limitations here by relying more on reliable sources. The study didn't consider protective factors, and we know from literature that talks about the importance of including protective factors. So there's no way of me to know what protective factors may have moderated those relationships or impacted the level of influence that those risk factors had. And the last issue is the representativeness of the sample. So obviously, PIRA captures both historical and contemporary threats based on that time, the years that it captures. So the data does reflect changes that have occurred in these times. So because the sample captures offenders over time, this is going to inevitably lead to sort of clustering of particular groups at certain timeframes. And this is just a function of changing trends and threats over time. But that doesn't necessarily mean that what I found doesn't hold relevance for policy and practice, which I'll talk about now. So overall, considering those three studies, I guess the main thing to take away from my findings was that there seemed to be differences between factors for risk of radicalisation and factors for risk of violence. So the presence of certain factors may not necessarily be related to or responsible for violent involvement, and pronounced risk factors, so the existence of a grievance, may hold some relevance in contextualizing levels of risk, but they may not be relevant to differentiating between the types of involvement. So essentially, together, it's saying that some risk factors may be relevant for certain types of involvement, and we need to consider the accumulative effect of factors and the ones that do interact to increase the risk of violence. And some maybe need to be considered more heavily than others when we look at CVE interventions in that regard. The other main aspect I think that needs to be considered, especially for intervention and policy and practice, is related to the findings from my integrated model, which found that social isolation and family members in particular were key in distinguishing participation in violent extremism. And if we consider those two things together, if individuals are at risk of radicalisation who are socially isolated, obviously we need to provide some sort of support to reconnect them with social attachments and activities, which is done in the CVE space, where we provide sporting memberships and engagement with the community more generally. But the other aspect to think about as well is if individuals' likelihood of de-radicalisation and how likely this is going to be if their radicalisation stems from the family environment. So the challenge here is how do we provide support for individuals who are experiencing social isolation if they're also being negatively affected by their family environment? So when we have to consider these types of things, we need to provide support without compounding these risk factors. And perhaps in those instances, it could be that family members are also a part of the target intervention as well, to then not increase these risks, and especially if we're looking at risk of violence. That's all from me. I hope everyone enjoyed that and that was clear. And if you have any questions, that would be great.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was absolutely brilliant. It is a really fascinating piece of work and set of interrelated studies. And of course, we have questions. So let me begin by taking everybody through some of the questions that are now appearing. So the first question, this speaker says the presentation was fascinating. What they would like to know is, in the social media platform and social media activities variables, as well, presumably, as the other communication media variables, you've said that platforms were chosen if they were found to play a role in the individual's radicalization and or mobilization. Could you speak a little bit about how you determined the way, whether or not the platform's activities or exposure did, in fact, play a role?
A great question. So when social media use is obviously quite broad. So obviously the use of social media or the internet more generally can be a place of isolation. So I tried to figure out a way of measuring this to ensure that the social media use was in fact related to mobilization or intent to engage in violent behavior. So the variables that I looked at really clearly distinguished between individuals that used social media or the internet as a passive intake, so if they were just reading or looking at extremist material, compared to those that were communicating with other extremists or reaching out to terrorist organizations or talking to other individuals about planning and preparing acts of violence. So that aspect of social media was the one that I looked at or tested, because theoretically, I would assume similar to offline networks, that those that are actually actively talking about it and discussing plans with others demonstrate some intent towards violence compared to those that perhaps are reading just materials or looking at videos. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you, Emma. I actually have a follow. I was going to ask a question myself, and it follows directly from this, so I might put it to you in a second. But just to finish off on this person's question, they're also asking if the fascinating studies that you've discussed here are going to be made available at any point.
Yes, they are. So my first point of call is to send this PhD off for examination. The next point of call will then, my plan is to publish these studies as soon as possible. So yes, they will be available hopefully sooner rather than later.
Terrific, thanks. Okay, look, let me insert my own question here because it makes such sense to follow up with this. It's really about how you've defined active versus passive engagement. Yeah. So you're saying, look, active engagement is about, whether or not people have communicated, and you've defined as passive people who are sort of merely consuming material, but without engaging. Now, my query is about whether there needs to, you would think that there might be benefit in refining that slightly, because what you've described as active engagement is actually about interpersonal engagement. But one can still consume violent or radicalized material online, and it's still very active, but it's imaginatively active. Yeah, so I'm thinking here about lone actors and people who are lone actors, not just when they're busy prosecuting an attack, but who are actually lone actors in the sense that their engagement is a solo engagement. But that doesn't necessarily make it less active. It's just active in a different way, not necessarily interpersonal. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about whether active-passive is something that could perhaps be a little more nuanced in the way that you're thinking about engagement more broadly in these online platforms.
No, absolutely. And that is a very good point and something that I did consider. Obviously, there are limitations with the data in my ability to be able to pick out those nuances, and perhaps me sort of making that distinction between active and passive may have then removed the acknowledgement that just because someone isn't communicating online doesn't necessarily mean that they're not actively involved. So that is something that I obviously didn't account for or consider, and it would be really interesting to figure out the different levels of engagement online and how that corresponds to different types of actors, because you said lone actors obviously typically aren't communicating online about their plans. So that does show some limitation in the sense that I didn't consider that, and that kind of removes that group of individuals who are, typically quite violent in nature. So that is something that I would definitely like to look at in the future and hopefully be able to gather more data to sort of inform that a bit more, because I guess my fear was that I was going to try and make these distinctions without any real backing based on the data.
Terrific. Okay, thank you for that. Look, the next question is about study 2 on emotional and cognitive states and triggers. So, how were these determined? This person is saying, they're assuming that it was based on case reports from psychologists or court actors relating to offenders' devotion to ideology, for example, or evidence of social isolation or evidence of anti-government sentiment, as opposed to self-report from the individual through interviews or surveys. So the question is really, was it observational and evidence-based from a third party, or was it based on their measurement of actual self-reports from the offenders? that make sense?
Yeah, so it was primarily based on evidence-based and not self-report because of the nature of the data that I used to collect this information. There was very clear parameters around the definitions of those variables because obviously they can be quite subjective. So when using specifically court data and the data more broadly, it was not based on the individual's perception or the individual's, I suppose, self-reporting. It was how they maybe express their beliefs online. So we got information from their social media use and their engagement with that and the level of, I guess, commitment based on that and how often they were disseminating or involved in those extremist ideas. And isolation was something that we looked at based off a range of different factors. So it was looking at their connection to family members, and that could have been through family members talking in court or at a sentencing, or it could be through other government-based reports that spoke to their removal from any social institutions or the fact that they were perhaps alone or in school. So we tried to draw on as much information we could based on the limitations we had and made sure that we coded very clearly around guidelines so we weren't assuming or, sort of making unsubstantiated claims based on the limitations around the data. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you. The next question relates to whether or not you had any breakdown. So given that the Islamist cohort was the largest, which makes sense, obviously, for historical reasons, given that that cohort was the largest in terms of inclusion, do you have a breakdown of any factors that helped assess or in other ways reflected the high level of diversity of different Islamic sects or types of Islamist ideologies? And then specifically, this person is asking, would any of your findings point to any higher risk factors, perhaps around intensity of belief or something else, for any particular kinds of Islamist ideology or groups?
That's a very good question. And I will say that isn't something that I looked at specifically. Obviously, there are different types and levels of Islamic involvement and engagement, and that has obviously changed across time. So we saw a different emergence in 2015 with the rise of the Islamic State, as opposed to historical sort of Islamist or jihadist aligned individuals that were much more Al-Qaeda influenced. So there are obviously nuances within the ideology itself, but I didn't consider or look at ideology in particular because I wanted to get an idea of generally what risk factors were associated with an extremist cohort, irregardless of the type of ideology they adhered to.
Good, thanks. The next question is on mental illness and its impact on risk for violent engagement. So did your studies identify any specific mental illness diagnoses as being more likely to have an impact on risk?
So because the data is qualitative and quantitative, we were able to capture qualitatively the different types of diagnoses. So when we were coding, we were very sure to speak to the types of mental illnesses that were captured. When that was used quantitatively, there wasn't any differentiation between the types of mental illness that I looked at. It was very much the presence or absence of a mental illness, irregardless of the type. That obviously is another nuance, which would be very interesting to look at. But we do have we do capture the types of mental illness, but this wasn't something that I looked at specifically.
Lovely, thank you. The next question relates to the online component of radicalization that you've been covering, and whether or not you were able to derive any insights on the different roles or functions of different social media platforms that emerged in PIRA.
So PIRA does capture a lot of different platforms. So we look at the types of platform and the type of engagement, and we capture that across a few variables. We also look at the intensity and the frequency of involvement, obviously, as much as we possibly can. Again, this is not something that I tried to distinguish or look at specifically. It was very much looking at generally overall how many individuals used social media and what type of involvement, but it wasn't down to that nitty-gritty, but it does capture levels from, as I said, making terrorist propaganda to talking directly to other extremists about plotting a terrorist attack to I think there's about 8 different sort of categories that we capture across, but again, not something I did in my study, but something that I think definitely should be done.
Great, thank you. The next question relates to whether or not you've got any advice about other databases or sources where violent and non-violent offenders might be included side by side. So it's really about, I think this is about, how are you aware of any other avenues relating to empirical work, considering the absence of violence as well as its presence?
So empirical work in the current literature or empirical work in general?
I would think in the literature, or else databases that people have going, perhaps that are not yet in the literature.
Well, yeah, so there was, I'm sure most of you saw a recent publication by Bart Sherman and Sarah McCarthy that looked at, again, the distinction between violent and non-violent extremists. So I think there's a lot of merit in looking at those distinctions, because obviously it's the latter that is of concern to policy and practice. They are a huge endeavor to compile these data sets, and there obviously are innate limitations in looking at the different types of offenders and the distinctions that you make, and especially when we're looking at how we define different offenders. But I think it provides a more of a nuanced approach. And to my knowledge, I don't think any other data source or set in Australia has looked at that. So I'm excited to publish out of that and to sort of build on existing literature, especially the PIRIS literature, that obviously there's a lot of literature out there that uses that to examine offender level characteristics. So I think that would be an interesting avenue as well.
Okay, good, thanks. So the next question, this person says they are not sure if they misunderstood, but hoping you can clarify. Was one of your findings that membership in formal terrorist organizations was associated with more non-violent behavior compared to informal cells or networks? Is that right?
So membership to a terrorist organization. So a terrorist organization in PIRA was defined as a designated organization by the Australian government. So Al-Qaeda, ISIS, actually in those types of organizations. Informal terrorist groups were those that were these self-made groups and cells of individuals that, typically plotted a terrorist attack. So informal membership was associated with violence. Formal membership was associated with non-violence.
So you were less likely to be violent if you were a member of
a terrorist organization,
of Al-Qaeda or Islamic State, right?
Yes, I think Bart and Sarah also found something similar. Okay,
good. All right, thank you very much. Okay, so the next question is, there's a lot of questions here.
I should have talked for longer.
Yeah, I think actually this has already been covered. This was about the high prevalence of mental illness, how you defined it, and whether you had a breakdown. I think you've already talked about that. Did you have anything you wanted to add there?
No, except for the sense that it obviously does include a broad range of mental illness. So that's not to say that having a mental illness was associated with radicalisation or not, but obviously it did capture quite a huge diagnosis spectrum, and based on that information, it was highly prevalent across the sample. All righty.
The next question wonders if you're able to elaborate on any data relating to the aggravating stroke negative factors that emerged from what should be protective environments, so families in particular. So it's not just about whether, I think this relates not just to whether the issue of whether families are radicalized or otherwise, but also you did talk about dysfunctional family backgrounds or context. So what did your data, what did a deeper dive into your data have to say about that?
So relating to, so PIRA also does capture what we would maybe consider protective factors. So it does look at things like an individual's closeness with their family unit. These are not things that I specifically looked at. It was very much, I sort of did a bit of a deeper dive into their backgrounds in general. And there was some evidence that, growing up in a single household or single parent household was highly prevalent across the sample, maybe comparative to other similar data sources. I didn't go into any further detail into how those impacted behavioural trajectories, because I thought that other factors were more important, and I wasn't looking specifically at those family bonds or protective factors. So I felt it was a bit off scope, but I think it would be very interesting as well based on the findings from family members and spouses. So I think it would be interesting to see those other factors and those sort of more upbringing variables and whether they have any moderating effects or aggregating effects on those outcomes. But the PIRA data does capture a lot of variables, and I was trying to condense down the ones that I thought were quite relevant. You could do thousands of studies with the amount of variables, but that isn't something that I did a deeper dive into.
I think I'll just add something here. I mean, I think that one really fascinating issue that your studies raise, I mean, there are assumptions about families offering protective environments, but that doesn't necessarily go, and they may have the desire to do that. That is separate to the question of efficacy and whether they have the means to do that. And I think that would be a really fascinating follow-up area to explore a little further. So thank you for that. So the next question deals with, given the variation in our understanding of how people can radicalize in terms of factors and drivers and the importance of context there, were there any strong Australia-specific contextual factors at play that you would say were meaningful, for example, in the PIRA data set, for example, in comparison to PIRUS or other non-Australian data?
So something that I did find that was quite interesting. So when looking at individuals' responses or feelings towards the Australian government more generally, there's also another variable that looks at a very similar thing, but towards foreign governments and leaders. So I actually looked at both of these factors. And what was interesting is that there was a high level of dissatisfaction with these structural political movements or policies, but it was the anti-government Australian sort of variable that seemed to come out as something that was more aligned with this pathway to violence. I actually looked at the same variable that talked about structural variables in relation to foreign governments, and that didn't seem to have any impact on violent outcomes. So it was quite interesting in the sense that those variables theoretically are the same. They are just looking at different structural levels. So one was looking at domestic and one was looking at international, and it was the domestic one that came out to be significant across a couple of the studies. So that does speak a little bit to governments and their associated agencies. There seemed to be that a lot of individuals were quite dissatisfied or felt quite targeted by their social structure, specifically those within Australia.
Okay, so again, a quick follow-up here. So anti-government sentiment, in the way that you're describing it, and this is actually about grievance or dissatisfaction with particular actions or with particular policies by an existing government, government of the day. Do you see that as different to anti-government sentiment where the idea of government is the target?
I do actually. And the only reason I say that, and this is purely based on the data that I have access to, but what sort of, I looked more closely at the data and looked at more the nuances, there was a lot of talk specifically about actions that seemed to be targeted, or individuals felt targeted by specific police actions or specific legislative changes or things of that nature. It wasn't necessarily the government in general. It was very much these targeted sort of offshoots of the government, and that was what that variable captured. So I would say yes, but tentatively yes.
Okay, great, thank you. And the next question, this is somebody who says they're from a university in Japan. They wanted to know if there is any evidence in your study or in the data that you were examining comparing radicalization processes of far-right extremists in terms of trajectory to jihadists. Were there any differences that emerged for you?
So I didn't look at ideological differences. The only thing I looked at was the sample that I drew on. So for violent and non-violent offenders, the ideological split was even, but I didn't look at the nuances of different types of ideology because that wasn't sort of within the field of what I was looking at. So the answer is unfortunately, no, I did not. But I would be interested to know if there are other factors that might be more relevant to, and obviously the research does tell us that certain factors are more relevant for aligned with certain types of ideological alignment.
Great, thanks. Okay, we are up to the last question. And this person would like to know, where do you want to take your research moving forward? You knew this was coming, right, Emma? Where do you want to take your research moving forward when the PhD is finished? And how do you see your current research as informing, that future work?
The first place I'm going to take myself is on a holiday. The second thing I'm going to do, I've actually been quite fortunate in being able to have access to this resource. So Adrian's been very good to me in the sense that I've been able to get quite a deep dive into these data sources, which are becoming quite common in the field. And it's really gotten me very excited and involved about these different trajectories and these different types of behavioural involvement. And I'm more interested in knowing if we can ascertain some sort of generalizable risk profile that doesn't consider ideology, because I think the finding that just the level of commitment to a belief may be more impactful than the type of ideology it is. And obviously there's a lot of research that looks at the differences between ideology, but I would really like to move forward and look at some more nuances. So this study was quite broad, and I'd like to get into some more nitty-gritty areas and perhaps build on the PIRA database with perhaps other sources and look at how these factors do interact and look at the difference between factors that might explain radicalisation in general and those that actually are relevant to explaining that progression to violence. So that's sort of where I expect my research to go, hopefully. But yes, that's where I expect it to go.
Okay, thank you so much. And I think this is the last question that we'll take, noting the time. So this is somebody who is asking, it's about mental illness again, wanting to know whether the range of diagnoses in your data included personality disorder diagnoses. And the reason this question is being put is because this person is not sure that it's clinically useful to have personality influencing or indeed inflating mental illness stats, if in fact they were included. Do you therefore have any thoughts, about how you might parcel out personality disorders from other forms of mental illness that are identified in PIRA?
That's a good question. So from off the top of my head, because I was quite involved with the data collection, I can safely say that personality disorders were not typically common. And if they were, we did rely heavily on it being officially diagnosed. So the prevalence of personality disorders in general, I don't recall being particularly high. In relation to separating them from other diagnoses, that isn't something that I looked at. And obviously, mental illness is quite broad. And I don't actually imagine it would have made a huge difference if we were to remove personality disorders based on the prevalence. As I said, I don't think it was particularly high in general. But something that I think future research has looked at the different diagnoses and their impact.
Okay, we've got one more question that's squeezed in. That I think is really going to be it. So this is coming back to anti-government sentiment and how you're defining that in your study. So this person is asking whether you would consider anti-government sentiment to be the same as or similar to, say, hatred towards democracy, or in some way related to the notion of patriotism?
So that is a good question. And I will say that the variable anti-government sentiment wasn't actually at what it was called when it was captured. That was just more of ease of writing. But talking more to that patriot level, this is sort of, that area was actually captured by a different variable, which was anger, which was also found to be significantly associated. So I see that there are some similarities, but they were quite distinct in the way that they were captured. So it wasn't for anti-government sentiment. If an individual had some dissatisfaction with democracy in general, that wasn't captured there. That was very much captured in the anger variable because it was this more broad stroke. anti-government sentiment looked directly at individuals that were clearly dissatisfied or had some frustrations with specific actions by the government in general, not the government as an entity in and of itself.
Okay,
So hopefully that is clear.
Yeah, it's very useful, I think, to have that clarification about how that term is being defined. So look, Emma, a number of people have also just written in to say, you know, thank you so much for your responses to these questions, wishing you the best for your future research. And I think it would be fair to say that that is a general sentiment, and certainly also from AVERT. So thank you so much. This has been a really fascinating and informative presentation, and we look forward to hearing a lot more about your work in the coming times.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Thank you so much, everyone, for your questions and listening to me. I appreciate it.
Okay, a pleasure. Thank you, everybody, and see you for the next AVERT webinar. Bye now.